Welcome to your Eye Articulate file. This information can be found in Chapter 16. Vision is the dominant sense in humans. Most sensory receptors are found in the eyes, and a big portion of the cortex, about 40%, is dedicated to processing visual information. The eye is about an inch in diameter, with only 1/6 of it showing anteriorly. The rest is in the bony eye socket, protected by extraocular fat. Eyelids are really called palpebrae. Palpebra is singular. We have superior palpebrae and inferior palpebrae. Where they merge at the sides of the eye and create an angle is called the medial and lateral angle, or canthus. Canthi is plural. On another side, I will show you, a muscle called the levator palpebrae superioris lifts the eyelid and allows you to see through the palpebral fissure, which is the slit between the palpebrae through which you see. Just to remind you that you use the orbicularis oculi to close your eye, and this is innervated by cranial nerve 7. People who have Bell's palsy have impairment of cranial nerve 7 and must tape their eyelid closed at night to sleep. Lastly, I would like to discuss the conjunctiva. It is a transparent mucous membrane that covers the inner surfaces of the eyelids, as the palpebral conjunctiva continues over the anterior surface of the sclera, or white of the eye. The portion over the white of the eye is called the bulbar conjunctiva and does not go over the surface of the cornea. What is conjunctiva anyway? It's stratified columnar epithelium, and its job is to make a lubricating mucus to prevent dry eyes. When the conjunctiva becomes infected with bacteria or viruses, it is called conjunctivitis, and it is highly contagious. I remember when Hayden was very young, maybe 18 months old, his daddy scheduled a play date with his friends' children. Really, it was an opportunity for Honey to hang out with his buddy, with hopes that the children would entertain themselves. Well, his friend shows up with his 2 children, both with flaming conjunctivitis, and his friend walks in and nonchalantly states, "Oh, they woke up with red eye today." Of course, I jumped all over him by stating a red eye is a flight a person takes in the middle of the night. Pink eye is what his children have, and it is highly contagious, and they need medicine. He replied to this by turning to my husband and said, "Oh yeah, that reminds me, dude. I have to leave by 12 o'clock for their doctor's appointment today to get their eyes checked." You need to picture me bleaching every toy and surface those children touched for the next 2 hours. Some toys did not survive the bleach treatment, much to Hayden's dismay. Lastly, when an eye is closed, the slit-like space that forms between the eye surface and the eyelids is called the conjunctival sac, and it is better appreciated on the next slide. Again, here is a better picture of the conjunctiva and the conjunctival sac. Look closely at this picture, and you'll see the artist drew the conjunctiva slightly pulled up as a free edge on the lateral side of the eye, just for demonstrative purposes. Notice how the palpebral and bulbar conjunctiva are really continuous with each other, and together create the conjunctival sac. Perhaps you wear contact lenses. Perhaps you have a friend who wears contact lens. Perhaps you've seen a contact lens. Maybe you only know what a contact lens is. Regardless, a person who wears a contact lens would place it onto the cornea, and when they close their eye, the contact lens would be enwrapped in the conjunctival sac. Up at the top, you see the levator palpebrae superioris muscle, the muscle responsible for opening your eyelid so you can see through the palpebral fissure. Students often ask what causes a stye on the eye. This is an infection of sebaceous glands, the oily glands found where your eyelashes, or cilium, attach to your eyelids. These glands can get infected and clogged up, leading to a bulgy stye. It really is a zit on your eyelid, right on the edge where your eyelashes come out. The lacrimal apparatus consists of all the structures seen here. Its job is to keep the surface of the eye moist with lacrimal fluid or tears. and it starts with the lacrimal gland creating tears that sweep inferiorly and medially, and these tears will eventually end up in your nasal cavity. Let's start with the lacrimal gland at the lateral superior portion of your eye. It produces the lacrimal fluid, which enters the superior part of the conjunctival sac through excretory ducts. The tears pool in your lacrimal lakes, better known as the lacrimal caruncle. This is the pink fleshy part found near your medial canthus. There, on your inferior palpebral, near the lacrimal caruncle, there is a tiny opening called the lacrimal puncta. You can see this if you look in a mirror or on your lab partner. The tears flow through these puncta into two tubes called lacrimal canaliculi. These tubes have valves that permit one-way flow of the tears toward the lacrimal sac. However, I saw a show where a boy was able to suck milk up through his nose and then squirt the milk up through his lacrimal sac, and as he squeezed his lower eyelid, he was able to shoot the milk, as if he had a squirt gun, through his puncta and douse a lit candle. He was also able to do this with just air and blow out the candle. I'm sure he's a load of laughs while blowing out the candles on his birthday cake. Anyway, the canaliculi are supposed to have one-way valves that allow the tears to enter your lacrimal sac. And then the tears travel through your nasal lacrimal duct, which leads to the nasal cavity at the inferior meatus found under the inferior concha. This is the reason why when you cry, your nose also runs. It's your tears running straight through to your nose. Lacrimal fluid contains mucus, antibodies, and lysozyme, which is an enzyme that can destroy bacteria. The pathway of a tear sounds like a delicious flow diagram opportunity. You have already covered the extrinsic eye muscles quite extensively for the muscle practical, and when I discuss the cranial nerves, you'll hear it again. The lateral rectus abducts the eye and is innervated by cranial nerve 6, the abducens. The superior oblique depresses and laterally rotates the eye and is innervated by cranial nerve 4, the trochlear nerve, because the superior oblique travels through the trochlea, or poli, a ligamentous sling found on the frontal bone at the top of the orbit. All other extrinsic eye muscles are innervated by cranial nerve 3, the oculomotor nerve. They are the inferior oblique that rotates the eye superiorly and laterally, the superior rectus which elevates and adducts the eye, the inferior rectus which depresses and adducts the eye, and the medial rectus which adducts the eye. Strabismus is the misalignment of the eyes. Normally, the eyes move together so they look at the same object. In strabismus, the affected eye turns either medially or laterally with respect to the normal eye. Some people call this, quote, lazy eye. It results from weak or paralyzed extrinsic eye muscles and needs to be corrected either by surgery or by wearing an eye patch, if it's due to muscle weakness. Because over time, the brain disregards the image coming from the affected eye, and the visual pathway for that eye degenerates and can make it functionally blind. The eye has layers to its external wall, a fibrous tunic, a vascular tunic, and a sensory tunic. These will be discussed in a bit. The internal regions of the eye can be divided into cavities, an anterior cavity or segment, and a posterior cavity or segment, and these contain fluids or humors. Dividing the anterior segment from the posterior segment is the lens, which focuses light onto the sensory tunic. The anterior segment has aqueous humor, and the posterior segment has vitreous humor. Let's first discuss the most external layer or tunic of the eye, the fibrous tunic. This consists of two structures, the sclera or white of your eye and the cornea. The sclera is an extension of the dura mater from the brain and provides a means for the extrinsic muscles to insert into to move the eye. The cornea is transparent and allows light to enter and helps bend the light. It is also important to note that it is avascular and receives its oxygen from the air in front of it and oxygen and nutrients from the aqueous humor behind it. I'll talk about the aqueous humor later. Although avascular, the cornea is innervated, especially with pain receptors. Touching the cornea causes reflexive blinking and tear production. The cornea is a layer of dense connective tissue in between corneal epithelium and corneal endothelium. Because the cornea is avascular, persons who have a damaged cornea can have a corneal transplant without a big risk for rejection. No blood means no immune cells to kill off the transplant due to foreign antigens. Where the sclera and cornea merge is called the limbus, which is the border between the corneal epithelium and the bulbar conjunctiva on the sclera. The limbus has epithelial cells that continually renew the corneal epithelium. In 10% of corneal transplants, the cornea is rejected, and it is because the limbus was destroyed. And without it, the corneal epithelium cannot regenerate, so the conjunctiva does, and this brings with it new blood vessels and subsequent immune cells. Deep to the sclera is the first layer of our vascular tunic, the choroid. The choroid is extremely vascularized and has a dark pigment due to the melanin formed by the melanocytes. This melanin acts as a way to trap light and prevent it from scattering. This layer is the equivalent of the arachnoid and pia mater of the brain. The next two layers of the vascular tunic are the ciliary body and the iris. Let's start with the ciliary body. It consists of smooth muscle called the ciliary muscle with its ciliary processes that have suspensory ligaments that anchor to the lens, creating the ciliary zonule. The ciliary body is innervated by cranial nerve 3, the oculomotor nerve. The ciliary body is an involuntary effector, and this means the portion of cranial nerve 3 innervating it represents an autonomic visceral motor division. When the ciliary body contracts under the influence of cranial nerve 3, the suspensory ligaments slacken, and this allows the lens to take a more rounded appearance, and this allows you to see objects up close, and this process is called accommodation. A flash movie will review this on the next slide, but for right now, I want you to know that your up-close vision is what you primarily use when you are resting and digesting, which means that cranial nerve 3's visceral motor division is really a part of the parasympathetic division. When you are in a flight or flight response, a sympathetic response, you lose the ability to contract the ciliary body by cranial nerve 3. Now the ciliary body relaxes and the suspensory ligaments tighten, and this allows you to see distant objects. I'm sure you will agree that when your life is in danger, it is in your best interest to be looking out for an escape path. The ciliary body also makes aqueous humor for the anterior cavity or segment, and this will be discussed later. Next, for the vascular tunic, is the iris. The iris is the colored portion of the eye and has a round central opening, the pupil. The iris is in charge of controlling the diameter of the iris in order to let in light to reach the retina. Look at the top picture in the screen and you will see 3 drawn iris and pupil pictures. There are 2 kinds of smooth muscle in the iris, circular and radial. Knowing what you know about circularly arranged fascicles and muscle, you should know that these fibers will behave like a sphincter, and the pupil will become lesser in diameter, and we call this pupillary constriction. The radial fibers project from the pupil outward, and when they contract, they open the pupil diameter, and this is called pupillary dilation. If I tell you that each of these smooth muscle groups of the iris are innervated by the 2 different autonomic nervous systems, can you guess which division innervates the sphincter? What about the radial fibers? Yes, the parasympathetic dominates the sphincter fibers, and the sympathetic innervates the radial fibers. Again, if your life is in danger, you want to let in as much light as possible so you are sure you can find your way out of a dangerous situation, particularly if you are in dim lighting. The constriction of the pupils that occurs when a bright light is flashed in the eye is a protective response called a pupillary light reflex. A fun thing to do is shine a light in another student's right eye while blocking the light from reaching their left eye by placing your hand along their nose. You will see that the pupils constrict in both eyes, even though the light is only hitting the right eye. Why? It's because of Hemi decussation, and you will learn more about this later.
The lens focuses light on the retina by bending light rays, and it changes shape to adjust focus when you look at near or distant objects. When you look at a nearby object, muscles attached to the choroid contract, allowing ligaments attached to the lens to slacken. This reduces tension on the elastic lens, which becomes thicker and rounder, bending light rays more sharply into focus. This is called accommodation. When you look at a more distant object, the muscles attached to the choroid relax. This allows the ligaments to pull on the edges of the lens, flattening it. The flatter lens bends light less sharply, focusing light from the more distant object onto the retina.
We now have reached the most deep layer, the sensory tunic or retina. The retina consists of two layers. The pigmented is just deep to the choroid, and the neural layer is just deep to the pigmented layer. The neural layer is thicker because of all the layers of cells you find in it. We will be reviewing the microanatomy of the neural layer more extensively when we go over your histology slides. Let's first talk about the pigmented layer. It too has melanocytes and functions like the choroid to prevent light scatter. A detached retina is when the pigmented layer detaches from the loosely joined neural layer and vitreous humor starts to collect in the area of detachment. This means the photoreceptors in the neural layer I will describe next are without a blood supply because they are now too far away from the vasculature in the choroid, and they start to die. The person frequently describes seeing spots or flashing lights. If diagnosed early, a bubble can be inserted into the posterior chamber that pushes the neural layer flush against the pigmented layer long enough to allow the thin extracellular matrix to reform. Now, lasers can do this job even better. The neural layer starts with photoreceptor cells being closest to the pigmented layer, followed by bipolar cells, and then the ganglion cells. The ganglion cells are the most internal as they face the vitreous humor of the posterior cavity. When stimulated by light, or photons, the photoreceptor neurons signal the bipolar cells, which then signal the ganglion cells to generate action potentials. Axons from the ganglion cells run along the internal surface of the retina and converge at the optic disc to leave the posterior eye as the optic nerve. Remind yourself, what is a nerve? Shown in the bottom picture is a picture showing the two different types of photoreceptors, rod cells and cone cells. The most numerous rod cells are sensitive to light and permit vision in dim light, but they do not provide sharp images nor color, so the images look gray and fuzzy when the action potentials are interpreted by the primary visual cortex. Cone cells operate best in bright light and enable high acuity color vision. There are 3 cone cells that are sensitive to blue, red, and green light. To me, the rod and cone cells look like squid, with the heads of the squid stuck in the pigmented layer. The soma of the cell looks like the eye of the squid to me, and the tentacles of the squid are fused together and project out toward the bipolar cells. In the portion that is inserted into the pigmented layer, there are piles of pigment discs. When photons hit the pigment, it becomes modified, and this changes the membrane potential of the photoreceptors to cause an action potential, which then travels to the bipolar cells, to the ganglion cells, where the action potential continues through their central processes, the optic nerve, to the optic chiasm, where Hemi decussation occurs, to be explained later. And the action potential continues in the axons inside the brain, now called the optic tract, back to the thalamus, to eventually be routed to the primary visual cortex. Why do you think the ganglion cells are called this name? What is a collection of cell bodies outside of the central nervous system? A ganglion. These are the cell bodies for cranial nerve 2, the optic nerve. I will do this again in a slide later in this PowerPoint lecture. There are specialized areas of the retina. First, the junction between the ciliary body and the neural layer of the retina is called the ora serrata. The macula lutea means yellow spot, and in the middle of the macula lutea is the fovea centralis, which means central pit. The fovea centralis only contains cones and provides the most acuity. Your eyes focus on objects, so the light emitted from them falls on the fovea centralis. Moving outward from the fovea, the density of cones declines with increasing distance. Therefore, peripheral vision is not as sharp as central vision. Where the axons of the ganglia cells exits the posterior eye is the optic disc. No photoreceptors are found here, as this is the point of egress for the axons, and therefore this creates the blind spot. It's easier to start a discussion on the internal chambers and their fluids by beginning with the posterior segment. Another word for segment is cavity. The posterior segment is filled with vitreous humor. This fluid is jelly-like, as you may have already discovered when dissecting your sheep eye. It contains fine fibrils of collagen and ground substance with a lot of water. Its functions include to transmit light, support the posterior surface of the lens, and help maintain intraocular pressure. This jelly-like substance was created when you were an embryo. The anterior segment, or cavity, is divided into two chambers: an anterior chamber bounded by the cornea anteriorly and the iris posteriorly. The posterior chamber is bounded by the iris anteriorly and the lens and suspensory ligaments posteriorly. The aqueous humor fills both these chambers. In fact, the aqueous humor is made as a filtrate of blood by the ciliary processes and flows from the posterior chamber through the pupil to the anterior chamber. Once in the anterior chamber, it can return to the cardiovascular system by draining through the scleral venous sinus found at the limbus. This structure was called the Canal of Schlemm back when I took anatomy. The synthesis of aqueous humor and its removal should be at equilibrium. When the aqueous humor drains more slowly than it forms, the result is glaucoma, and this means that intraocular pressure increases to dangerous levels, which can cause compression of the retina and optic nerve and leads to blindness. If detected early enough, glaucoma is easily treated with eye drops that decreases production of aqueous humor or encourages its drainage. The lens is a thick, transparent, biconvex disc that changes shape to allow focusing of light on the fovea centralis on the retina. A cataract is the clouding in the lens resulting from lack of nutrients delivered to the most internal fibers of the lens. The lens can be replaced with an artificial lens. Here is a superior view of the brain, eyes, optic nerve, and optic tracts. The green and purple boxes are placed in front of the face and represent the visual fields of the person. I will show you on the next two slides how each eye sees a portion of the other eye's visual field, and this gives us our biocular vision. Notice before I begin that the medial axons from the ganglia found on the medial side of each retina cross over at the optic chiasm, but the lateral axons for each eye stay ipsilateral, or same side. This means that only half of the axons cross over to the opposite side of the brain. This is called Hemi decussation. Notice that the lateral side of the left eye and the medial side of the right eye both trap photons emitted from the purple visual field. In contrast, the medial side of the left eye and the lateral side of the right eye trap photons emitted from the green visual field. Then the axons from the medial side of both eyes are the axons that decussate. The lateral fibers stay to the same side of the brain. This is hemidecussation. Notice that the thalamus routes the fibers posteriorly as the optic tract, a collection of axons inside the brain. So they carry the impulses to the primary visual cortex. Therefore, the left side of the cortex receives information from the right visual field, and the right side of the brain receives information from the left visual field. If someone were to sustain brain trauma to the right occipital lobe, in what visual field would they be blind? If you said the left visual field viewed by the medial left eye and lateral right eye, you'd be correct. Let's go through the entire visual pathway. Light enters through the palpebral fissure and through the cornea, travels through the aqueous humor of the anterior chamber of the anterior cavity, and then travels through the pupil, its diameter controlled by the iris. When the photon travels through the pupil, it then enters the posterior chamber of the anterior cavity, which is also filled with aqueous humor. Then the photon travels through the lens, which is bent to ensure the photon will land on the fovea centralis for the best acuity. As the photon travels through the vitreous humor of the posterior cavity, it will pass the ganglion cell bodies, pass the bipolar cell, and pass the cell bodies of the photoreceptor cells to react with the photoreactive pigment within the discs found at the tip of the photoreceptor cell, which is embedded in the pigmented layer of the retina. When photons hit the pigment, it becomes modified, and this changes the membrane potential of the photoreceptors to cause an action potential, which then continues through the bipolar cells and is transmitted to the ganglion cells, where the action potential continues through their central processes, called the optic nerve, to the optic chiasm, where hemidecussation occurs, and the action potential continues in the axons inside the brain, which is now called the optic tract, back to the thalamus, to eventually be routed to the primary visual cortex. Doesn't this sound like a fabulous short answer flow chart type of question for your next lecture exam? I think it does. Now that you have listened to this PowerPoint lecture, I hope you will have an easy time cutting your cow eye in a coronal fashion to separate the anterior and posterior portions of the eye. Be mindful to keep your mouth closed during the cutting, as sometimes the aqueous humor or vitreous humor tend to spurt out.